Imagine for a moment that you are a soldier in the mid-18th century. You are a man of the Enlightenment era, raised in the ordered, tilled fields of England or the crowded, cobblestone streets of London. Your understanding of warfare is mathematical and precise. It is a geometry of death played out on wide, open plains, where armies line up like chess pieces, flags snapping in the wind, drums beating a steady, reassuring rhythm. You know that if you stand your ground, fire in volleys, and trust your officers, order will prevail over chaos. You are a redcoat, a cog in the most disciplined military machine the world has ever seen. Now take that soldier and drop him into a nightmare. Strip away the open fields, erase the roads, blot out the sun with a canopy of ancient timber so thick that noon looks like twilight. This is the North American frontier in the 1750s. It is a green hell of humidity, insects, and silence. A silence that is heavy and watching. Here, there are no lines. There is no geometry. There is only the tangled undergrowth, the rushing rapids of uncharted rivers, and an enemy you cannot see until the muzzle flash blooms from the darkness. This is the story of the French and Indian War, a conflict that many historians view merely as a prologue to the American Revolution. But to see it that way is to miss the terrifying reality of what actually happened here. This was not a war of rebels against a king. This was a clash of empires, Britain and France, fighting for the soul of a continent. And for the British Empire, it began as a catastrophe. It was an impossible war, fought by an army that was functionally blind, deaf and mute in an environment it did not understand. To understand the sheer scale of this disaster, we have to look at the map. In the middle of the 18th century, North America was a vast, unclaimed prize. The British colonies were huddled along the Atlantic coast, a thin strip of civilization looking east toward Europe. To their west lay the Appalachian Mountains, a formidable stone wall that kept the colonists contained. But beyond that wall lay the Ohio country. This was the key to the continent. The rivers here flowed west and south, eventually feeding into the Mississippi. Whoever controlled these waters controlled the trade, the movement, and the future of America. The French understood this. They had already established a vast arc of influence stretching from Canada in the north down to Louisiana in the south. They were building a chain of forts to lock the British out of the interior. If they succeeded, the British colonies would be strangled, forever pinned against the ocean, unable to grow. The British government in London saw this existential threat and decided to act. They would send their best. They would send the regulars, but the British military planners made a fatal error. They assumed that war is universal. They believed that a battalion that could defeat the French in Europe could defeat the French in America just as easily. They did not account for the wilderness. The American forest was not just a backdrop, it was a combatant. It was a logistical black hole that swallowed armies whole. There were no supply depots. There were no roads for the heavy artillery wagons. There was no forage for the thousands of horses. When the first waves of British troops arrived, they were weighed down by tradition. A standard British infantryman carried 60 pounds of gear, wearing heavy wool coats that trapped the sweltering American heat. They were trained to march in tight columns, a tactic designed to maximize firepower against a visible enemy. But in the Ohio Valley, a tight column was just a target. The wilderness negated every advantage the British had. Their cannons got stuck in the mud. Their supply lines were easily severed. Their discipline became their death sentence. We often think of the British redcoat as the oppressor, the faceless force of tyranny that the American patriots would later defeat. But in this war, the redcoat was the underdog. He was lost, terrified, and fighting for survival in a land that seemed to want him dead. He was facing an enemy that had adapted to this environment for centuries, an enemy that moved like smoke and struck with the violence of a lightning bolt. This series will document how the British Army was brought to its knees by the wilderness, and how, through blood and disaster, they were forced to reinvent themselves. They had to unlearn the rules of civilized warfare and embrace the savage logic of the frontier. They had to become something else. To understand why the British struggled so mightily, we must look at who was waiting for them in the shadows. The British assumption was that they were fighting the French army, a mirror image of themselves. They expected gentlemen officers, white uniforms, and honourable surrenders. But the forces defending the French claim to North America were a different breed entirely. These were the Compagnies Franches de la Marine, the independent companies of the Navy. Unlike the British, who insulated themselves from the frontier, the French had embraced it. For generations, French traders and soldiers had ventured deep into the interior, far beyond the reach of their colonial governors. They became coureurs des bois, runners of the woods. They lived among the tribes, learned their languages, and married into their families. By the time the war began, the French forces in the Ohio Valley were a hybrid force. They wore moccasins and leggings instead of stiff gaiters. They greased their bodies with bear fat to repel the clouds of biting insects. They travelled by birch bark canoe, moving silently and swiftly across the vast waterways that the British regarded as impassable barriers. They were the ghosts of the forest, combining European discipline with the survival skills of the indigenous population. But even more terrifying to the British regular were the Native American warriors allied with the French. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Ottawa, the Ojibwa. To the British mind, warfare was a state activity, governed by rules and treaties. To the warriors of the Western Confederacy, war was personal, spiritual, and total. They did not fight for a king across the ocean whom they had never seen. They fought for their hunting grounds, their families, and their survival against the encroaching English settlers. This clash of cultures birthed a specific style of combat that the colonists called the skulking way of war. In Europe, hiding during battle was viewed as cowardice. A soldier stood tall to show his bravery. Here, hiding was common sense. The enemy would not stand and fight in open ranks. They used the massive oaks and maples as shields. They utilised the rolling terrain to funnel the British into kill zones. They targeted officers specifically, looking for the men on horseback or those wearing the shiny gorgets of rank. This was a breach of European military etiquette, where officers were often ransomed or treated with deference. But here, killing the leaders shattered the chain of command in the first few minutes of an engagement, leaving the rank and file leaderless and confused. Then there was the psychological component. Diaries of British soldiers from this era often mention the sound before the sight. Before a single shot was fired, the woods would erupt in a terrifying, ululating scream, the war cry. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees, amplifying the sense that the British were surrounded by thousands. It was designed to induce panic, to break the nerve of men who were already on edge. And it worked. The fear of capture was palpable. Stories of ritual torture and scalping circulated through the British camps like a contagion. The Redcoat was not just afraid of death. He was afraid of what came after. He was fighting an enemy he considered a savage, in a land he considered godless. And that psychological weight was as heavy as his musket. The British soldier relied on massed volley fire to break an enemy charge. But you cannot volley fire at a ghost. The French and their native allies would fire from cover, drop to the ground to reload, flank the British position, and fire again. By the time the British levelled their muskets at the smoke, the enemy was gone, moving to a new position. It was a fluid, dynamic form of warfare that the rigid British drill manuals had no answer for. The Redcoats were trying to box a shadow, and in 1754, this mismatch would spark the war in a remote glen. Led by a young, inexperienced Virginian officer named George Washington, Washington's ambush at Jumonville Glen was a debacle. It ended with a French officer dead, and Washington signing a confession written in French, a language he did not read, admitting to assassination. The French were furious. The British were embarrassed. But London decided that the time for colonial skirmishes was over. They would settle this with the blunt force of the Royal Army. They would send a sledgehammer to crush a fly. Enter Major General Edward Braddock. Braddock was the embodiment of the old world military mind. He was brave, brutal, and utterly inflexible. He arrived in Virginia with a mandate to sweep the French from the Ohio Valley. When Benjamin Franklin warned him about the danger of Native American ambushes, specifically noting how the slender line of troops would be cut like a thread, Braddock famously replied that while savages might be formidable to raw American militia, they would make no impression upon the king's regulars. It was a statement of staggering hubris. He believed the geometry of war was superior to the geography of the land. Braddock's plan was to march on Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio, where modern-day Pittsburgh now stands. But first, he had to get there. His army effectively became a construction crew. They hacked a road through 110 miles of virgin forest, blasting rocks and felling ancient trees to create a path 12 feet wide for their heavy artillery. It was an agonizingly slow process. The heat was oppressive, turning the wool-clad soldiers into walking casualties of heat stroke. Disease ran rampant. The forest felt endless, a claustrophobic tunnel of green that seemed to close in behind them as they passed. But Braddock pushed them on, a red caterpillar inching its way toward the enemy. On July 9, 1755, they were just miles from the fort. The army was in high spirits. They had crossed the Monongahela River in perfect formation, drums beating, bayonets glistening in the sun. It was a display of imperial power meant to awe any watching spies. But as the vanguard moved up a narrow wooded slope, they collided head-on with a mixed force of French Marines and native warriors rushing to meet them. It was an encounter battle, a surprise for both sides. But the reaction of each side decided the outcome. What happened next was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The French and Indians immediately scattered into the tree line, flanking the British column on both sides. They turned the road into a killing jar. The British advance guard fell back, colliding with the main force moving up. Chaos reigned. The Redcoats, terrified by the invisible enemy and the deafening war cries echoing through the ravines, tried to do what they were trained to do: form lines. But in the dense woods, there was no room. They bunched together in huddles, firing blindly into the trees, often hitting their own comrades in the confusion. The smoke from hundreds of muskets hung in the stagnant forest air, blinding them further. Braddock rode into the thick of it, a furious figure on horseback, beating his own men with the flat of his sword, forcing them to stand and die in formation. He viewed taking cover as cowardice. He had 4 horses shot out from under him before a bullet finally pierced his lung. The command structure collapsed. The discipline that was supposed to save them became their cage. For 3 hours the British army was dismantled piece by piece. The savages Braddock had dismissed were picking off his officers with terrifying precision. When the retreat finally sounded, it was a rout. They fled back down the road they had spent months building, leaving behind their cannons, their baggage, their general's reputation, and the bodies of over 450 men. The invincible British machine had been broken not by a superior army, but by the wilderness and the men who knew how to use it. The defeat of Braddock did not just break an army, it broke the psychological dam holding back the violence of the frontier. For the next 2 years, the British colonies bled. Raiding parties struck with impunity, burning settlements from Pennsylvania to New York. The line of civilization was pushed back by 100 miles. In London, the government was reeling. In America, the soldiers were paralyzed by the fear of an enemy they could not catch. But in August 1757, the horror would reach its apex at a wooden outpost on the southern tip of Lake George, Fort William Henry. This event is perhaps the most infamous of the war, immortalized in fiction and film, but the reality was far more complex and tragic than the myths suggest. It was here that the incompatibility of European and indigenous warfare was laid bare with devastating consequences. The French commander, The Marquis de Montcalm was a man of the old world. He brought a massive force down Lake George to besiege the British fort. His army was a strange tapestry: disciplined French regulars in white coats, Canadian militia in hunting shirts, and nearly 2,000 Native American warriors from 33 different nations. Some had travelled from as far as the Great Plains, drawn by promises of glory, captives and plunder, and, for several days, the siege played out like a textbook European engagement. Montcalm dug trenches. He positioned his artillery. The British commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Monro, held out bravely until his walls were crumbling and his ammunition was low. Seeing that honour had been satisfied, Monro surrendered. In the tradition of European chivalry, Montcalm granted the British the honours of war. This meant the British garrison would not be taken prisoner. They would be allowed to keep their muskets and one cannon, and they would be granted safe passage to Fort Edward, provided they did not fight for 18 months. It was a civilized end to a violent affair. The officers likely shared wine and compliments, but to the Native American allies of the French, this agreement was incomprehensible. It was a betrayal. They had not travelled thousands of miles to watch French and British officers tip their hats to each other. In their culture, the purpose of war was to take captives to replace the dead in their own tribes, to gain trophies of war, and to secure plunder. Montcalm had essentially invited them to a hunt and then forbidden them to touch the prey. The French had promised them the spoils of war to secure their alliance, and now, with a handshake, Montcalm was breaking that promise. The cultural disconnect was absolute. As the British column, including women, children, and wounded, began their retreat the next morning, the tension snapped. The native warriors, feeling cheated and ignored by their French fathers, took matters into their own hands. They moved in. It started with the taking of small items: hats, coats, weapons. Then a war whoop sounded. Chaos erupted. The warriors attacked the column, dragging men and women from the ranks. The British soldiers, with empty muskets and strict orders not to provoke a fight, were helpless. The massacre that followed was not the systematic slaughter of thousands, as sometimes depicted in propaganda, but it was a terrifying breakdown of order. Hundreds were killed or dragged away into captivity. Montcalm and his officers rushed into the fray, risking their lives to stop their own allies, begging the warriors to take them instead. But the damage was done. The British survivors fled into the woods, arriving at Fort Edward days later, half naked and gibbering with terror. For the British, the massacre at Fort William Henry was proof that they were fighting a war against savages where no rules applied. It hardened their hearts. The time for gentlemanly warfare was ending. If the wilderness was going to be unforgiving, then the British army would have to become unforgiving in return. They realized that to defeat this enemy, they could not just rely on the slow, plodding methods of the past. They needed to evolve. They needed men who could move through the woods as silently as the enemy. They needed to turn the environment from a foe into a weapon. The British Army was about to undergo a radical transformation, and it would start with a man who had more in common with the natives than with the king he served. His name was Robert Rogers. He was a man of the New Hampshire frontier, a large, imposing figure who knew the forests better than he knew the drawing rooms of London. While the British generals were studying geometry, Rogers was studying survival. He understood that in the American wilderness, the standard rules of engagement were a suicide pact. To defeat the French and their indigenous allies, the British needed a force that could match them in stealth, endurance, and brutality. They needed the Rangers. Rogers recruited men who were already hardened by the frontier. These were not the discipline-drilled automatons of the regular army. They were woodsmen. They wore green, not red, an early form of camouflage that allowed them to melt into the foliage. They didn't carry heavy knapsacks or standard issue swords. They carried hatchets, scalping knives, and powder horns. They travelled light, slept on the ground, and moved on snowshoes in the winter, when the regular army was holed up in winter quarters. Rogers codified his methods into a document that is still studied by special forces today, the 28 Rules of Ranging. These were not abstract theories, they were blood-written lessons. Rule number 2. If you march over soft ground, march abreast, that you may not be tracked. Rule number 20. If the enemy is so superior that you are in danger of being surrounded, you must scatter, and every man go a different way. This was a doctrine of flexibility. It taught soldiers to think for themselves, to use the terrain, and to fight with the cunning of the wolf rather than the brute force of the bull. The impact of Rogers and his Rangers was immediate. They became the eyes and ears of the British Army. They launched deep raids into enemy territory, burning villages, gathering intelligence, and spreading terror among the French. For the first time, the French were the ones looking over their shoulders. The psychological dominance of the skulking way of war was being challenged, but the transformation didn't stop with a few companies of irregulars. The lessons of the Rangers began to bleed into the regular British Army. This shift was championed by Brigadier General George Howe, a charismatic leader who was willing to throw the rulebook into the fire. Howe looked at his redcoats and saw men dressed for a parade, not a war. He ordered them to cut the tails off their long coats to free their legs. He had them crop their tricorn hats into small caps that wouldn't catch on low-hanging branches. He threw away the useless hair powder and made them grease their muskets with tallow to prevent rust in the damp forest air. Under Howe's influence, the British formed light infantry companies. Regulars trained to fight in open order, to skirmish, and to screen the main body of troops. They learned to fire from behind trees. They learned to move silently. The British Army was shedding its European skin. It was becoming a hybrid beast, retaining the discipline and firepower of the old world, but adopting the mobility and adaptability of the new. By 1758, the tide began to turn. The British were no longer stumbling blindly into the woods. They were building a logistical machine that could sustain them. Learning from Braddock's failure, General John Forbes launched a new expedition towards the Ohio Valley. But unlike Braddock, Forbes moved methodically. He built a string of fortified depots every 40 miles, safe havens where his army could retreat if attacked. He didn't just cut a road, he built a lifeline. Simultaneously, the British unleashed their most potent weapon, the Royal Navy. By blockading the French ports, they cut off the flow of supplies, trade goods, and reinforcements to Canada. The French forces in the interior, who relied on gifts to maintain their alliances with the native tribes, found their warehouses empty. The Western Confederacy began to fracture. The warriors, seeing the British approach with overwhelming numbers and realizing the French could no longer pay them, began to drift away. The green hell was being tamed, not by conquering the trees, but by strangling the enemy who lived within them. The stage was set for the final act, not in the dark woods, but on the high cliffs of the French capital in America. Quebec City was not just a settlement, it was a statement of defiance. Perched atop a sheer rock face known as Cape Diamond, it loomed over the St. Lawrence River, guarding the entrance to the North American interior. To the military minds of the 18th century, it was the Gibraltar of the West. As long as the French flag flew over the citadel, the British could burn every village in the Ohio Valley and it wouldn't matter. New France would survive. To end the war, the British had to cut off the head of the snake. The man sent to do this impossible job was Major General James Wolfe. He was an unlikely hero. 32 years old, gangly, prone to illness, and socially awkward, he was described by some of his own officers as mad. But Wolfe possessed a manic energy and a singular obsession with military glory. He did not want to just win, he wanted to destroy the enemy. He arrived in June 1759 with a massive fleet of nearly 200 ships, navigating the treacherous currents of the St. Lawrence to anchor right under the noses of the French. Inside the fortress, the Marquis de Montcalm watched the white sails fill the horizon. He knew he had the advantage. He had more troops, he held the high ground. and he had the calendar. All Montcalm had to do was wait. The Canadian winter was coming. By October, the river would begin to freeze. If the British fleet was still there, the ice would crush their wooden hulls like matchsticks. Wolfe had a deadline. If he couldn't take the city before the first snow, he would have to retreat in disgrace. The summer turned into a frustrating game of cat and mouse. Wolfe tried everything. He landed troops on the North Shore, only to be repulsed by entrenched French positions at Montmorency Falls. He set up artillery batteries across the river and bombarded the city day and night, reducing the beautiful stone churches and homes of Quebec to rubble. He unleashed his rangers on the surrounding countryside, burning farms and villages in a campaign of terror designed to draw Montcalm out. But the French commander refused to take the bait. He stayed behind his walls, safe and secure, watching Wolfe's army wither from disease and frustration. As September approached, the British situation was desperate. Wolfe was bedridden with a fever, racking his brain for a solution. His generals were advising a retreat, but Wolfe would not leave. He began scouting the river himself, looking for a chink in the armor. Through his telescope, he spotted a narrow, jagged goat path winding up the side of the cliffs at a place called Anse-au-Foulon, just west of the city. It was steep, narrow, and guarded by only a small detachment of French militia, because no sane commander would try to land an army there. It was a suicide mission. To succeed, the British would have to navigate the tidal currents of the river at night, land silently in small boats, scale a 200-foot cliff in the dark, overpower the guards at the top, and then assemble a battle line before the main French army could react. If they were spotted on the water, the French cannons would blow them apart. If they were pinned down on the cliffs, they would be picked off like birds on a wire. It was a gamble that defied all military logic. It relied on surprise, silence, and the sheer physical endurance of the men, qualities the British had learned the hard way in the American wilderness. On the night of September 12, 1759, the operation began. The British placed lanterns in the rigging of their main ships to make it look like they were preparing for a landing miles away, a decoy to distract Montcalm. Meanwhile, a stream of flat-bottomed boats drifted silently downriver with the tide. In those boats sat the elite of Wolfe's army, including the light infantry and the Highlanders. There was no talking. Oars were muffled with cloth. As they drifted under the looming shadow of the cliffs, a French sentry called out from the shore. A Scottish officer, fluent in French, answered in the darkness, pretending to be a French supply convoy. The sentry, satisfied, let them pass. They hit the beach at 4:00 a.m. The men slung their muskets on their backs and began to pull themselves up the roots and rocks of the cliff face. It was a physical struggle against the geography itself. At the top, they surprised the sleeping French post, silencing them before the alarm could be raised. 1 by 1, then 10 by 10, then 100 by 100, the Redcoats hauled themselves up from the riverbank to the grassy plateau above. By the time the sun began to rise over the Saint Lawrence, the impossible had happened. Montcalm woke up to a nightmare. He looked out the window of the fortress and saw, standing on the open fields known as the Plains of Abraham, a solid red wall of 4,000 British regulars, ready for battle. This was the moment the entire war had been building toward. For 5 years, the British had tried to fight the French in the woods, where the chaos of the frontier stripped them of their advantages. But Wolfe had changed the game. By scaling the cliffs, he had forced the French onto a European chessboard. He had turned the wilderness war back into a gentleman's war. Now, there were no trees to hide behind, no ravines for an ambush, just a flat open field, perfect for the geometry of death the British knew so well. Montcalm was now faced with a terrible choice. He knew that British reinforcements were likely close behind. He knew that the British fleet controlled the river. If he waited, the British might dig in and starve him out. So, driven by a mix of pride and desperation, Montcalm decided to attack immediately. He poured his troops out of the city gates, a mix of white-coated French regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors. It was a formidable force, but it was uncoordinated. The militia were used to skirmishing, not marching in rigid lines. As they advanced across the field, the French formation began to waver and bend. On the other side, the British line stood like a statue. Wolfe had ordered his men to load their muskets with 2 balls each, double-shotted, for maximum devastation. He walked the line, calm and composed, telling his men to hold their fire. This was the supreme test of discipline. The French were firing as they advanced, ragged volleys that tore holes in the British ranks. Men fell, screaming, but the line did not break. The gaps were simply filled by the men behind them. They stood silent, muskets shouldered, watching the enemy close the distance. 100 yards, 80 yards, 60 yards. The French were shouting, sensing victory, their bullets whistling through the air. Wolfe waited until he could see the whites of their eyes. At 40 yards, point-blank range, the order finally came. Fire! The result was a sound like the cracking of a single massive whip. A cloud of white smoke instantly obscured the field. It was later described as the most perfect volley ever fired in the history of warfare. Thousands of muskets discharged in unison. 2 balls from every barrel smashed into the French ranks. When the smoke cleared a few seconds later, the French army was gone. The front line had been erased. The survivors were staggering, dazed, looking at the heaps of dead around them. The British reloaded and fired again. Then, a primal roar rose from the British line. The Highlanders, drawing their broadswords, surged forward through the smoke, followed by the bayonets of the infantry. The battle, for all intents and purposes, lasted 15 minutes. In a quarter of an hour, the fate of North America was decided, but the victory demanded a blood price. As the charge began, General Wolfe was struck in the wrist, then the gut, and finally the chest. He collapsed on the field. As he lay bleeding out, he heard a soldier cry, "They run! See how they run!" Wolfe whispered, "Who runs?" "The enemy, sir," the soldier replied. "They give way everywhere." Wolfe closed his eyes, reportedly saying, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He was dead before the battle was officially over. Across the field, the Marquis de Montcalm was trying to rally his retreating men when a bullet punched through his back. He was carried back into the city, his white uniform stained red. When the surgeon told him his wound was mortal, he replied, "So much the better. I shall not see the surrender of Quebec." He died the next morning and was buried in a crater made by a British shell. The fall of Quebec did not end the fighting immediately. There would be another year of skirmishes and a desperate French attempt to retake the city, but the back of the French Empire in America had been broken. The British had achieved the impossible. They had dragged an army through the wilderness, adapted to a new way of war, and struck the killing blow in the heart of enemy territory. The Union Jack rose over the citadel of Quebec, marking the beginning of a new era. But as the smoke cleared over the plains of Abraham, a new question began to form. Britain had won the continent, but at what cost? And what would they do with this vast, restless wilderness now that the common enemy was gone? When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the map of the world was redrawn. France, the great rival, was effectively erased from North America. Britain now possessed a domain that stretched from the frozen Arctic waste to the Florida Keys, and from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River. It was the greatest territorial victory in the history of the British Empire. Church bells rang across England. Bonfires were lit in the colonies. It felt like the dawn of a new golden age. But victory, as it turns out, is expensive. The war for the wilderness had bled the British treasury dry. To fund the fleets, the armies, the forts, and the Indian alliances, the British government had borrowed astronomical sums. The national debt had nearly doubled to over £130 million, a figure so staggering that the interest payments alone threatened to cripple the nation. The king and parliament looked at their ledger, then they looked at the map, and they came to a logical conclusion. The war had been fought to protect the American colonists. Therefore, the American colonists should help pay for it. This logic, born from the ashes of the French and Indian War, became the spark for the American Revolution. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the tea taxes, these were not the arbitrary whims of a tyrant. They were the desperate accounting measures of a bankrupt winner trying to pay the mortgage on a new continent. The Redcoats, who had been hailed as saviours when they marched to fight the French, were now kept in the colonies as a police force to ensure the taxes were collected. The heroes became the occupiers. Furthermore, the war had fundamentally changed the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. Before the war, the colonists clung to Britain for protection against the French threat. But with the French gone, the threat was removed. The colonists looked west at the vast open lands of the Ohio Valley, the very lands they had bled to secure, and saw their future. But Britain, terrified of another expensive war with the Native American tribes, issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To the colonists, this was a betrayal. They had fought for the land, and now the king was locking the gate. The irony is tragic and profound. General Wolfe's victory at Quebec, which secured the continent for Britain, actually ensured that Britain would lose it. By removing the French, he removed the colonists' need for the British Empire. By bankrupting the treasury, he forced the policies that drove the Americans to rebellion. And by training men like George Washington, the British inadvertently created the very leaders who would defeat them. Washington, who started the war as a clumsy 22-year-old, causing a diplomatic incident in the woods, ended it as a hardened veteran who understood the British military mind inside and out. He knew their tactics, he knew their arrogance, and most importantly, he knew they could be beaten in the wilderness. And what of the indigenous nations? For the tribes of the Ohio Valley and the Northeast, the end of the war was a catastrophe. They had expertly played the two empires against each other for decades, maintaining their autonomy by being the balance of power. With the French gone, the diplomatic leverage vanished. They were left alone to face the tidal wave of British expansion. Though they would fight on, most notably in Pontiac's War just months after the treaty, the geopolitical reality had shifted against them forever. So why is this war forgotten? Why does it sit in the dusty corners of history books, overshadowed by the War of Independence that followed just a dozen years later? Perhaps because it is messy. It lacks the clear moral narrative of tyrant versus liberty that defines the revolution. It was a war of empires, fueled by greed and imperial ambition. It was a war where the good guys and bad guys depended entirely on which side of the tree line you were standing on. It was a war of atrocities, of scalping knives and smallpox blankets, of broken promises and shifting alliances. But to ignore the French and Indian War is to ignore the crucible that forged the modern world. It was the moment when the British Army learned that the map is not the territory. It was the conflict that proved that in the Americas, the environment itself is the ultimate conqueror. The Redcoats came to the wilderness expecting a contest of gentlemen. They found a fight for survival. They won the war, but the wilderness changed them. It stripped away their pomp and circumstance, leaving behind a harder, more pragmatic reality. The ghosts of that war are still with us. You can see them in the names of the towns: Pittsburgh, Amherst, Rogers Rock. You can see them in the geography of the United States and Canada. And you can see them in the DNA of the American military tradition, which learned its first and hardest lessons not on the drill fields of Europe, but in the dark, unforgiving shadows of the American woods. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.